Self-Consecration, Section 7. For here, there are two movements with the transitional stage between them, two periods of this yoga. One of the process of surrender, the other of its crown and consequence. In the first, the individual prepares himself for the reception of the divine into his members. For all this first period, he has to work by means of the instruments of the lower nature, but aided more and more from above. But in the later transitional stage of this movement, our personal and necessarily ignorant effort more and more dwindles and a higher nature acts. The eternal Shakti descends into this limited form of mortality and progressively possesses and transmutes it. In the second period of the greater movement, wholly replaces the lesser, formerly indispensable, first action. But this can be done only when our self surrender is complete. The ego person in us cannot transform itself by its own force or will or knowledge or by any virtue of its own into the nature of the divine. All it can do is to fit itself for the transformation and make more and more its surrender to that which it seeks to become. As long as the ego is at work in us, our personal action is and must always be in its nature a part of the lower grades of existence. It is obscure or half enlightened, limited in its field, very partially effective in its power. If a spiritual transformation, not a mere illumining modification of our nature, is to be done at all, we must call in the divine Shakti to effect that miraculous work in the individual. For she alone has the needed force, decisive, all wise, and illimitable. But the entire substitution of the divine for the human personal action is not at once entirely possible. All interference from below that would falsify the truth of the superior action must first be inhibited or rendered impotent, and it must be done by our own free choice. A continual and always repeated refusal of the impulsions and falsehoods of the lower nature is asked from us, and an insistent support to the truth as it grows in our paths. For the progressive settling into our nature and final perfection of the incoming informing light, purity, and power needs for its development and sustenance our free acceptance of it and our stubborn rejection of all that is contrary to it, inferior or incompatible. In the first moment of self preparation, the period of personal effort, the method we have to use in this concentration of the whole being on the divine that it seeks, and as its corollary, this constant rejection, throwing out, catharsis of all that it is not the true truth of the divine, an entire consecration of all that we are, think, feel, and do will be the result of this persistence. This consecration, in its turn, must culminate in an integral self giving to the highest, for its crown and sign of completion is the whole nature's all comprehending absolute surrender. In the second stage of the yoga, transitional between the human and the divine working, there will supervene an increasing purified and vigilant passivity, a more and more luminous divine response to the divine force, but not to any other. And there will be, as a result, the growing inrush of a great and conscious, miraculous working from above. In the last period, there is no effort at all, no set method, no fixed sadhana. The place of endeavor and tapasya will be taken by a natural, simple, powerful, and happy disclosing of the flower of the divine, out of the bud of a purified and perfected terrestrial nature. These are the natural successions of the action of the yoga. These movements are indeed not always or absolutely arranged in a strict succession to each other. The second stage begins in part before the first is completed. The first continues in part until the second is perfected. The last divine working can manifest from time to time as a promise before it is finally settled and normal to the nature. Always, too, there is something higher and greater than the individual which leads him even in his personal labor and endeavor. Often he may become and remain for a time wholly conscious, even in parts of his being, permanently conscious of this greater leading behind the veil. And that may happen long before his whole nature has been purified in all its parts from the lower indirect control. Even he may be thus conscious from the beginning, his mind and heart, if not his other members, may respond to that ceasing, penetrating guidance with a certain initial completeness from the very first steps of the yoga. But it is the constant and complete and uniform action of the greater direct control that more and more distinguishes the transitional stage as it proceeds and draws to its close. This predominance of a greater diviner leading, not personal to ourselves, indicates the nature's increasing ripeness for a total spiritual transformation. It is the unmistakable sign that the self-consecration has not only been accepted in principle but is fulfilled in act and power. The Supreme has laid his luminous hand upon a chosen human vessel of his miraculous light and power and ananda.